Alright, so we're going to move along to Chapter 4, which is about doing literature reviews. So imagine this. It's Monday morning. You've come to school or work or whatever social place, and you find there's this group that's just kind of hanging around outside. They're discussing the controversial call from last night's football game, right? So you have two choices. Do you A, approach the group, listen for a minute, try and catch the thread of the conversation, and then try to figure out how you can contribute meaningfully to this conversation? Or B, approach the group, immediately begin to loudly babble every random fact you think you know about football in hopes that someone will find something that you say to be interesting. So if you picked option B, well, you probably need to go get help. Most socially intelligent people would pick option A, to listen to the conversation, find out what people are talking about, and then find a way to contribute meaningfully to that conversation. In a nutshell, that's really why we're doing a literature review. It's not really about one person on the mountaintop laboratory making random discoveries about the nature of the universe. That's not what research is about. Rather, it's done as a community. We are a community of researchers. And in this community, there are active conversations that are taking place. At times, sometimes these conversations are like arguments. Most often, it's more of a collaborative tone. We are all trying to work together collaboratively to build a body of knowledge that we can rely on. So when you're coming to a research topic, it's a good idea to get the entire conversation, to get yourself really well informed about what people are talking about on this topic. You want to avoid cherry picking just the sources or the parts of the conversation that are going to support sort of a preformed position. That's not really scientific. That's what they call bias, which we need to avoid in doing research. A strong literature review should be able to stand up to and address criticisms from other voices that are in the field. A good literature review should be able to take all of this information and summarize it and synthesize it to come up with a strong original position on the topic. And this can include critically engaging with arguments from other voices or other positions in the field. Additionally, you need to know what conversations are taking place so you can figure out how your own study is going to meaningfully add to them. There's no sense in doing a study that's already been done. I mean, why would you, right? You don't want to reinvent the wheel, but you can certainly improve on the wheel using or building on prior wheel research, and give the credit where credit is due, of course. But that's how progress is made, is that we further sort of the advances of previous studies. So if you recall from the previous lecture notes, and I was making kind of a big deal about how the research study is guided by a research question, right? And everything flows from that research question and needs to serve answering that research question. A review of literature is going to help you ask an informed research question. It can also help inform your design. So let's say that I'm doing a qualitative grounded theory study on the process of students who are developing sort of a theoretical orientation towards counseling. I'm sure somebody's already done this study. As part of the study, I would want to interview some participants. Contrary to what Glasser says, and I think that's a quote from page 89 in your text, a literature review is actually going to help us ask interview questions that are likely to yield data that'll be helpful in answering the research question. Without doing that literature review, we don't know what is the most relevant kind of area that we need to focus on. We just start asking questions and it'd be kind of like shooting in the dark. Reviewing literature could tell us that in counselor development, one of the most important areas to look at is actually in the practicum experience. And so that might be an area that we want to focus on when we're doing our interviews. It's also important to kind of keep in mind that when you look at that reference in the text, Glasser's point of view on avoiding the literature review until after data is collected, definitely in the minority. Most qualitative researchers and all quantitative researchers agree that a literature review is important. Similarly, when we're doing observations, we also want to be guided in what it is that we're observing. We can't possibly observe everything at once. As like subjective human beings, we have kind of a frame of reference that we have to pay attention to, a few things or certain things, but not necessarily everything. It's not possible. If in the literature it says that peer conversations are very important in developing a theory, then I'm going to be looking for those peer interactions when I do observations. So, you're asking informed research questions, you're using the existing literature to help guide your research design. Then when your study is over, you want to go back to the literature once again to just see how your findings or your results of your study compare to what's already known, or how does your study fit into what we already know. Does it agree with other studies, or does it contradict maybe some things that other people have believed? What are the implications of your study for the field going forward, the future of this topic? So far we've been looking at literature reviews from the perspective of doing research. I want to sort of give you maybe another perspective as well on why doing a literature review is important and sort of how it functions as a literary device in a research article. As we've already noted, the first thing that the literature review does is communicate that you're informed about the conversation that's already in progress, right? You know a little bit about what you're talking about. It also situates and embeds your study in the context of this greater conversation that's happening, right? So you're not doing like an isolated study, you're actually doing a study within a context of other research that's out there. And so it's important to note how your work relates to other works that have been done in the area. Secondly, we stand on the shoulders of giants and borrow their authority when we do a literature review. For example, I could claim that when we speak, we use these acoustic sounds to refer to these mental concepts, right? Words related to ideas. And that we can study the relationship between these things in a sort of holistic way. But seriously, who's this Maxfield guy, right? He's just stating, and it might be an interesting opinion, but it's unfounded, right? It's just me talking. But in 1916, Ferdinand de Saussure was a philosopher who talked about the relationship between signifiers and signifieds, between words and things or concepts. If I cite de Saussure, I've got what's called citational authority. I've got him in my corner backing up my claims, right? People know and respect who de Saussure is. He's been published, and his ideas have been accepted in the academic community. Therefore, it's not just me talking out of the opposite end of my digestive tract. I have somebody to back me up. So also in doing a literature review, you're going to demonstrate why anyone should care about your study. You explain how the study is going to add to this conversation that's already happening in the field in a meaningful way, right? Why it's important for people to read your study. And you communicate the practical importance of the study as well. How is it going to impact people in the real world? In a sense, lit review can be kind of like selling your study to your readers, right? You're basically saying, here's what's being said in this conversation already. Here's what hasn't been said yet, but I'm intending to say it, and it's going to be important, and it's going to make the whole conversation much more awesome, so you should really listen to this. Finally, the lit review is needed to kind of set the stage for your study. What you're doing is you're providing all of the information that's necessary for your readers to fully understand and appreciate the study the way that you want them to. So to give you another example, also football related because it's that time of year. My partner and I, we went out to sort of a bar and we were having food and drinks and stuff, and there was a football game on. And so she really doesn't understand anything about football, zero concept of it. And so she was watching, and she had no idea why people were cheering or what they were cheering at. And she was like, why are all those guys just jumping all over each other? Like, this doesn't make any sense. It's a crazy game, right?
And Ron Winter just got buried. Oh. And then, of course, he's underneath the scrum going for the football, and Ron Winter all but disappears.
The fact is, Football has a clear set of rules and strategies for winning. But since my partner didn't have a literature review to give her an understanding of what those rules were, everything seemed just really random and chaotic to her, and she didn't understand it. The lit reviews should tell your readers everything they need to know in order for them to appreciate the study the way that you want them to. Right? Let's talk a little bit about theoretical frameworks. As I noted before, quantitative researchers tend to operate from the logical positivist framework. It values objectivity and empirical measurements. But qualitative researchers, on the other hand, they rejected that framework, if you remember. They don't believe that it's possible to know anything from this objective or disembodied perspective. We all bring unique perspectives to whatever it is we research, which means that any given phenomenon can be looked at from a number of different perspectives. This is sometimes referred to as the Rashomon effect, after the classic Japanese film by Akira Kurosawa, in which the same event is told several times from several different perspectives. What this means is that the researcher must be intentional about the perspective that they bring to the research project. It's not simply about reporting what is, like you would from an objective perspective, but rather reporting how a phenomenon is examined and made sense of. In other words, qualitative researchers often develop a theoretical framework, which is a kind of lens that helps them understand the study in a particular way. Theoretical frameworks often come from philosophies of inquiry and epistemology. For example, my dissertation is going to use Deleuze and Guattari's ideas of the machinic assemblage, which is kind of a postmodern theory, as a framework for understanding how families change from addiction to sobriety. Of course, there are other ways to understand the same transformation. For example, you could use a Bowenian family systems theory, or you could use like Freudian psychoanalytic perspectives, or any other number of different theories to explain the same thing. So we've been talking about what a literature review is and what it does for a research article. Let's talk a little bit more about how you actually conduct a literature review. Now, a good literature review is often said to be comprehensive, and this idea of being comprehensive is often very overwhelming, especially for people who are new to the process of doing research. So let's say we're looking at children's cognitive development. Now, there's been a ton of work that's been done in this area over like this last century or century and a half, and it would take more than a lifetime to just read all of the material that's out there. However, you should know that a lot of the literature that's out there, especially the older literature, is probably obsolete and out of date. It might be of value for historical purposes. Sometimes you might want to go back and say, well, this is how people understood things. The exception, of course, is what are known as seminal works. Basically, these are the important texts that influence the thought on the subject. So, in the case of the cognitive development, you don't need to cite everything, but if you're not at least familiar with Freud, Piaget, Vygotsky, or Bandura, you'd probably be considered poorly informed about the topic. So in addition to familiarity with seminal works, a literature review will look at relevant current research as well. People's definition of what actually counts as current varies from person to person. I've heard that anything that's been published in the past 15 years can be fair game, and there are others that claim that anything that's older than 5 years is already out of date. Sometimes that depends on the field and how fast research moves in the field, but you really need to kind of just use your own best judgment on that. However, I will say that if all of your resources are from like the 1980s, people are going to ask if you just stopped doing any reading, back when Nirvana dropped Nevermind. That also means that staying current in the research is important. Usually it's a good idea to identify the major journals in the field. These are usually part of the flagship professional organizations, things like NACADA for academic advising, or the ACA for counseling, American Educational Research Association. So there are a lot of different organizations, and depending on what you're specifically studying, usually there's an organization for that and a journal associated with it. So once you've found the major journals in your field, it's usually a good idea to go back and review the journal, review all the research that has been published by that journal for the last, I would say 5 to 10 years is usually a pretty safe bet, and that'll keep you current. I might not be interested in every article that's published in the journal, but I can at least review the titles of the journal articles really quickly to see what kind of topics are being addressed by these articles. And if I'm interested in one, I might read a little further, right? I might look at the abstract first of all to make sure it's actually talking about something that I'm interested in. And then if I'm really, really interested in that topic, I might read further through the entire article. And so you can actually review quite a bit of literature really quickly by just scanning through the titles until you find the articles that address specifically what your research topic is going to be. And if you can do it that way for, let's say, 3 or 4 different journals related to the field, then I think you'd have a pretty good idea of what the current conversations are in that field. And that's a pretty good systematic process for getting a literature review done. It's also important to keep in mind that a literature review is not a book report. It's not about reading an article and then summarizing it and then going on to the next article and summarizing that one and so on and so on. Journal editors generally aren't going to be very impressed with that. Rather, they want you to be able to synthesize the information you're finding in these different articles in order to produce a coherent argument for your own research. The readers are going to be interested in what you think and how you've arrived at your positions. If they want to read the source material or the source articles, that's why you have a list of references. They can go back and look them up and read them for themselves. You don't need to summarize them for them. Your job is to weave together all these different strands into this coherent kind of argument and justification for your own project. So let's talk about academic sources. Look, I like Wikipedia. Anytime I want to just know something quickly, Wikipedia is usually the first source I'll turn to. And I probably shouldn't tell you how much time I spend looking up just random things like colony collapse disorder or the political history of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's a lot. But maybe one day I'll be on Jeopardy and I'll be playing for like $1 million and something will come up that I've looked up on Wikipedia. So it's not an entire waste, right? I hope. Unfortunately, though, when it comes to academic rigor, Wikipedia is actually considered fairly poor. And the reason is that anybody with an internet connection can log in at any time and write whatever they want to write on Wikipedia. It's open source. So Wikipedia is not really a great source. Just whatever turns up on Google. Google's not really a great search engine for academic research. And definitely those sketchy sites that your cousin keeps posting on Facebook, those aren't really great sites for research either. So when you're doing a literature review, there's actually a hierarchy of sources that you'll want to be aware of. And I'm going to put a list here and sort of show you. Okay, so we've talked about lit review. Now let's sort of switch track back to research questions. And I know we talked about it last time. We're going to get a little bit more in depth with it this time. The text gets really complicated about research problems and questions and purposes and hypotheses and all of that stuff. I mean, they really kind of make a mess of it, I think. I want to try and make it a little bit less confusing. So let me give you the basic structure for doing a quantitative research question. We're going to come back to qualitative later, but this is sort of a template that you can use for structuring your quantitative questions. Basically, when you're doing quantitative research, you're asking, what is the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable? Keywords that would clue you into the fact that you're dealing with a quantitative question might include things like affect. How does the independent variable affect the dependent variable? What is the effect on the dependent variable? Increase or decrease, influence, impact. It's always some sort of verb. What is the independent variable doing to the dependent variable? Quantitative questions are going to be closed-ended. They're going to be answered by yes or no, or maybe some kind of specific figure. Like
how many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man?
They involve some kind of measurement or counting, so either through categorical or continuous variables, if you remember from last time. And they always involve some kind of comparison between things. So generally they call it a between groups comparison or a within groups comparison, but there's always some kind of comparison involved. So let me give you some examples of quantitative research questions that you might come across. What is the influence of mindfulness practices on disciplinary referrals in elementary schools? Do awareness campaigns increase student utilization of online academic advising resources? Is an emphasis on microskills training effective in developing competent school counselors? Just to give you kind of a really quick comparison, we'll come back to this again later in the course, but qualitative research questions are phrased differently. They're structured, what is the experience of X phenomenon for Y people, or what is the process of doing X behavior for Y people, or what is the meaning of X phenomenon for Y people. So meaning, process, experience, those kinds of things. They're not designed to be answered by a single response, but to expand our understanding of the phenomenon in sort of a rich descriptive way. Qualitative questions require sort of an in-depth exploration of the lived experience of participants. Since qualitative research assumes that people are more or less unique and kind of dynamic, they're not going to make a lot of comparisons between groups or anything like that, and they're definitely not going to use any kind of statistical analysis. Hopefully you can see the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. For some reason, when students have read the text in the past, they come away with this idea that qualitative research questions are just a more vague way of asking your quantitative research, which obviously is not true. Always remember, quantitative and qualitative are not just two different ways of doing research, but they're two different ways of thinking about doing research. And that means that they're going to ask very different kinds of questions. Okay, so in quantitative research, after we ask a research question, we tend to generate hypotheses. Qualitative researchers, on the other hand, are not interested in hypotheses. They're more into open-ended exploration. So this is specifically for quantitative research. The hypothesis is a clear statement of your criteria for determining a conclusion from your results. So in one of the earlier examples, we were asking, is there a relationship between awareness campaigns and student utilization of online academic advising resources? There are two possible answers to this question. One, yes there is, or two, no there isn't. Now we're going to start with a default assumption, which we call the null hypothesis. It's commonly noted as H0. The null hypothesis is a statement of the status quo. It's what we would expect if no relationship exists. And the reason it's the default is, as we were talking about last time, the need for falsifiability. I asked you to prove to me conclusively that you've never been an axe murderer, and it's not something that you can do. We assume that there's no relationship until we can find evidence that one exists. So in our example, our null hypothesis is that student awareness campaigns will have no effect on whether students are using online resources for academic advising. The alternative hypothesis, on the other hand, this one's commonly noted as H1, is logically stating what we would expect to find if there is a relationship between the variables. It's an alternative to the null hypothesis. This is what we need to see in our results in order to reject the null and accept the alternative. Or you might state it another way, this is what we need to see to assume that there's a relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable. In our case, the alternative hypothesis might be that following the implementation of student awareness campaigns on campus, we'd see an increase in student utilization of online resources for academic advising. Now that we've stated the hypotheses for this research question, we have a clear set of guidelines for determining what the results mean after we collect the data. If we see an increase in students utilizing online resources, then we can reject the null and state there's a relationship between that utilization and the awareness campaigns, which was the independent variable. On the other hand, if we find that there was no increase and everything just kind of stayed the same, then we could probably conclude that the campaign never really had any effect on student utilization.